The Flames. History's greatest secret and key to a future where ships travel lifetimes to bring flames to new worlds. Those who dare to walk the fire can cross between the stars with a step if you can find a ferryman and pay your way across. For most who brave the flame alone are lost forever. May the ferryman take you. Crucible and Flame. 7. The ferryman was fogging up the spacesuit's visor with his short, panting breaths. Terror and exertion left him weak and twitching as he followed the others through the empty commons. It scared him, the stillness of the place. His mind was fractured. Part of him ran, stumbling to follow Lieutenant Cho and his men. Tender Cable was there to push him ahead, to keep him on his feet. And idly, he wondered when the ferryman had become part of the tender's flock. Then his bowels filled with ice as he realized all the tender's flock were in danger. He'd known that in the gray matter stuffed between his ears, but he hadn't felt it before that moment, too busy being terrified for his own skin. That fractured his mind into many more pieces, alternating terror and introspection. He staggered along behind the crew and the spiritual leader of Ship 227 as the vibrations beneath his feet, signaling explosions and devastation, petered out. He careened off the stalls of the traders and sellers where he'd traded honey for fresh warm bread just days before. He wondered where they were now, prayed they were all safe. He thought of the giggling boys who had dragged him onto the 5-ball pitch, who had laughed at his feeble hits and shrieked in joy when he caught them out before they could safely clear the field of play. He prayed they were all safe. He laughed again. Hell, he prayed the bees in the hive were all safe. That was a lot of praying for a man who believed in nothing more than his own precious skin. Then he thought of the bloated dead bellies of the fish in the steaming water of the algae pools. He prayed harder, for far more than just himself. "Let's go! Let's go!" Lieutenant Cho's voice screamed from the speakers in his helmet as he held the door open to a squat house near the center of the common. He slammed each man on his back as they entered, then he did the same to Cable, and then the ferryman, who marveled at how the rough clap on his back both comforted and galvanized him. Inside, the illusion of a dwelling disappeared. 2 large equipment elevators filled the space. Lieutenant Cho and his men were already inside the closest of the 2 circular cages. Tender Cable pushed him forward. "Let's go, Deva." The man's gentle humor ran through his words and broke the ice gripping the ferryman. He snorted. "Not feeling very enlightened," he told the man as he jerked his legs into motion and jogged forward into the entrance of the cage and ran to an empty seat to strap in. "More worried about soiling my suit." 2 of Cho's men were still with them. The ferryman had no clue who they were beneath the identical black and orange spacesuits, but he thanked them as they worked in tandem to clip him down to the seat. He white-knuckled the straps as soon as they patted him on the shoulder roughly, reassuringly, and returned to their own perches. "It's been 40 years since I was weightless," he murmured. Lieutenant Cho laughed as he lifted the clear cover of a control box near his seat. The sound was forced, an imitation of the gentle, joyful humor he had heard the man make at the dinner in his honor just an hour before. "Forget about browning your shorts, then. Concentrate on not puking. We don't have time to hoover out your helmet if you do." He turned one knob and the cage door rumbled shut. The yellow markings surrounding the cage began to glow and strobe. He turned another knob and the elevator cage dropped into the floor. Mechanical vibration massaged the ferryman's spine. "Warning," a crisp digital recording of a man's voice announced in their ears. "Now exiting gravity. Warning." Before the voice could repeat itself, the bones in the ferryman's ankles floated ever so slightly apart from each other. Then his knees, then his hips. His back spasmed as his lizard brain rebelled against the overturning of the laws of nature, but his neocortex knew enough to breathe and relax. Walls of a silo surrounded the cage. Artificial lights on the cage grew brighter as the lights above disappeared behind a rolling ceiling. "Warning," the artificial voice sounded again. "Elevator bay atmosphere not purged. Please conserve Cho twisted several more knobs. The voice cut off. The air around his suit shuddered and sucked at him. The pull quickly faded. Then the walls disappeared, and the hidden underbelly of Ship 227 was revealed. Generation ships were kilometers long, some were kilometers deep. Beneath a few stories of artificial gravity and a shell of oxygen lay the ancient mechanical whales that carried pockets of humanity on their backs. No oxygen was wasted in the guts of the machine. How wasteful would that be? The dim light of emergency exits was sufficient in the vacuum to carry light to the human eyes surveying the vast cavern they were descending into. Below them lay vast fields of towers, pipes, coils, and canisters peppered with work platforms and conveyor belts. The ferryman closed his eyes, arguing with his stomach how ridiculous it was being, fearing what it perceived as the drop below. There was no gravity, ergo no drop. His mind went a little too far, visualizing the decades it would take, at near relativistic speeds, before Ship 227 was close enough to a planet's gravity well for anything on board to drop anywhere. He pulled back from that line of thought as his chest tightened again, remembering how very much farther away it was to any other place he could breathe without a tank of air, or where he could empty his bladder in comforting gravity not provided by 227's machinery, which was in the midst of the catastrophic collapse. "If you have to choose, I'd go with shitting yourself," Cable joked. Cho and his men laughed. So did the ferryman. The moment of camaraderie stretched into hysterical laughter, and all assembled indulged in the release. The laughter was followed by more nerves, and a long silence, accompanied only by the vibrations of the elevator cage's motors as it dropped down to the floor stories below. Then a ding sounded in his helmet, and red flashing letters appeared on its heads-up display. All around him came whoops of joy as the emergency status updates filled the inside of his visor and theirs. Ship 227 wasn't dead after all. Not yet. Lights flickered to life all around the motorized flatbed before Lieutenant Cho's fingers grabbed onto the railing and hauled himself inside. "Alas!" he bellowed, even as he braced his knees inside the flatbed and hauled on the cable connecting all 5 men. The ferryman was next in line, followed by Cable, and then Cho's other officers, more experienced in operating in 0G, at the rear. "Hamilton, you're driving. Hernandez, what's not broken on this whale?" The sweat of terror was cold and tangy in the ferryman's mouth. His adrenaline was still pumping, but he could feel the exhaustion not quite kept at bay, and his mind was battered with too many thoughts to get worked up about any one as he clipped onto a safety strap at the far end of the flatbed. Ships didn't end. They just didn't. Well, okay, maybe once every couple hundred years, ferrymen reported a flame had been snuffed out, which only ever happened due to massive subatomic change or total vacuum, or a telescope caught the burst of a whale being snuffed out. Too much money, too many dreams, too many lives were wrapped up in the launching of a generation ship. The world fought too hard to hold on to them. Here, in the bowels of the whale, the terror of his imminent death had washed away. The hurt in its place was new and greater. His head jerked, his back twisted as the flatbed started into motion along a rail towards the front of Ship 227. He shivered. He was terrified for all the short-lived sparks he had met and huddled now in shelters above, waiting for the oxygen or heat to fail or supplies to run out and leave them starving to death with their loved ones. "Diagnostics are coming in from the engine, sir. Tech divisions, commons too," Hernandez replied, wiggling his fingers in the air ahead of him to manipulate what streams of data he could access. His hands froze in midair. "Nothing from the bridge," he whispered. "We'll hit the main line at the next forward airlock wall and no more," Cho cut off Hernandez, projecting confidence and purpose. A heavy silence filled the space of his words as the flatbed sped along in its track. A chirp in his ear drew the ferryman's attention. A white line indicated a private voice request from Tender Cable's suit. He wiggled his fingers to open the circuit. "Pants get any heavier yet?" The ferryman ignored the joke and the comforting tone. "What's your first name, Tender?" "Just Tender now." Tender Cable's faceplate, seated across from him, reflected a passing light that hid his face, but his shoulders shrugged. Generation ship captains all get Columbus added to their name, and Tenders give theirs up. Some BS about living for their charges, not for themselves. "So what's your first name, Tender?" he asked again, bullishly. The Tender waved his hand as if he were swatting at a bee. "I don't need one." The ferryman thought about that. "Can I have yours? I don't really like mine." "You still on about that?" Cable chided and waved around him. "Bigger fish to fry, friend." A flash of light drew his eye, and the ferryman craned his neck to look ahead. Emergency strobes illuminated the blackness with reflections of tall towers, massive knots of pipes and machinery, and a solid wall ahead. The sheer number of emergency lights became an inferno of color as they approached. Somewhere ahead was the flame. A few steps beyond that was safety. He swallowed hard. Safety for a few, for as many as he could lock hands or legs together, or tie onto a line he carried through. For the faces he knew behind him, above in the commons, the flame meant nothing. The squat building at the base of the wall had its own power and its own gravity plate. Cho ripped off his helmet as soon as the inner airlock was closed behind the last man and dragged holograms into the air around himself. All his men did the same around themselves. "You don't need a name," Cable said again, distracting the useless, helpless ferryman. The ferryman bit, gratefully. "No, what do I need?" Cable looked at him carefully and nodded. "You've got everything you need." He laughed harshly. "You see a flame in here?" Cable clucked. "Shit, that's just conditioning talking. You don't need the flame any more than I need the church. Could use a cup of matcha, though." The ferryman got angry. Something boiled in him. He stormed away, sliding into the head just as Hamilton exited. The call of nature answered. He stared in the mirror. Eyes wide, right cheek tattoo dripping with sweat, left cheek ticking like a motor. Why was he so angry? Why did he want to grab the Tender with no first name and shake him? When it came to him, he didn't feel enlightened or special, or particularly grateful for having deciphered the change in his needs and wants. He washed up and cleared the head for the next man, crossed to a modular couch against one wall and sat beside a dozing Cable. They waited. They took turns catnapping, and the ferryman was intellectually shocked at the stillness that had replaced the fury and the terror. He only smiled when Cho came to him, white-faced, and knelt, and whispered the news to the two men on the couch. Cable waved his hands when Cho repeated his words, incredulous at the two men's calm acceptance. And the ferryman just said, "We heard you. The flame room is gone. We're on our own. Just tell me how we're going to save this ship." Walk the Fire by John Miro. Learn more at servingworlds.com. Theme music, Full On by Kevin MacLeod of Incompetech.com. Many of the stories you listen to here on Serving Worlds were made possible by the support of patrons at patreon.com/servingworlds. If you got $1 of entertainment from this story, please consider backing me for $1 at patreon.com/servingworlds. Thank you for listening.